Sao Paulo, they're doing it themselves, right? And they've done a lot of, they're actually included in the report.
Yeah, of course.
And they have not just fantastic services.
Thank
for
you.
refugees, but they have fantastic services for.
I actually, it's the other way. Sorry.
Where they retroactively gave you this period of
Thank you, I appreciate it. I think everything's good. Just I should be ready for everything.
But I was really looking for this.
No, but he's going over there, so we're going to see him. And I think the point you're making is really important to meet the needs of already resident marginalized populations at the same time. There's ways that meeting refugees populations and that will benefit both and create a sense that everybody's
Sorry. No worries.
no excuse. Arrange that.
We also have a letter. Yes, as is my children now. Oh, no, I think you want to say many years. Souls and where are you from?
She was like, you should check out what the
Where is your
I would say
I work for a family health care, so I'm based out of Washington.
well, figure out how it is.
Yeah, well,
Like, what sort of angle to that you want to take? We focus on and you swing around. The only thing is the
do they care where we are? No, I don't know. Oh, yes. Oh. Here? Hi.
yeah.
Oh yeah, us. Yeah.
Hi.
How are you?
We do have a clicker, yes. We do. Yep.
You guys will put up the PowerPoint.
Yep, we can get that set for you. Yeah.
No, it's the order. Oh, I know. It just got here.
Yeah. So when we speak, you can either go up there or speak in the mic.
Hey, how you doing? You look very swish. All dressed up.
Yeah. So you'll be able to go there.
Very yeah. How's it been going? In her excellent. What do I do in my life? Right now, is there plenty of provocation around? That's usually what was that? I was in Chicago. I came back from this another country. So,
So that you can, if you wanted to relax a bit, that'd be fine.
Oh yeah. Well, I have some things to say about that. Is he around?
If you want, when you speak in your presentation, you can go up there and also just if you
I think that's. I know that ideology, and I'm really not engaging. But I love people's I won't know this. I have a very good. I've been involved with the IGL for 30 years.
I'm not sure about
And I must say that they managed to put out.
become red.
It's one of my favorites. Next time you ever come to my office, I'll show you. There's one they did on India, and there's a young boy throwing a ball, a cricket ball, and there's the backdrop of a landscape. It's just fabulous. I work for it. I would. Oh wow, you guys are the smart people.
That would be incredible. And especially
The relief. Well, I think this is the year to be on India, next year, because I mean, with Modi, with this election, I think everything is going to be serious.
Yeah, I mean, it's practically a promise now.
I mean, he's just delaying calling the dates because he wants to give gifts to farmers so that they vote for him. So,
But I just
we have to see whether there's another little episode across the board.
I'm
Really
really
dangerous stuff. Well, yesterday I was talking about it at the conference.
After I finish, I go home.
Yeah, now I'm in Cambridge, Goldman, and master degree at Harvard. So I'm moving here to see. For 2 months, I'm coming back to Venezuela.
Okay, so yeah, if you want to
Like, okay.
it goes yellow when it's 2 minutes and red when you're cooking. It's high tech.
Yeah, I have an
high tech
technology
technology.
in NGO. So we are working on
I think the questions are always great. I think
The migration issue.
yeah, not the migration.
The issue in Venezuela.
It's actually like
The whole thing.
the whole thing, the human rights thing, the very broad approach,
There's this part
happening in
goes
many ways.
in USB.
So being an NGO, you have to
I think.
address many issues.
And
It's difficult to be only focused on
you have that.
one single thing.
Well, and it's so critical that you have that actual knowledge. We had somebody from my
Where are you coming from?
I work at the World Bank in the research department.
I see.
And
That's an interesting composition of people, an academic, a practitioner,
Yes.
and a practitioner.
in the bank or here?
No, I mean at the bank.
Yeah. Well, yes, definitely. Yeah, it's been good. I enjoy it. I mean, my unit is much more academic
I see.
than the rest of the bank
Okay,
would
alright.
like us to be.
I see.
So there's that constant tension.
But you're from Turkey.
I'm Turkish.
Chala.
well, I have to actually.
I have a very friend, name, surname was Chala.
Okay. It actually was a poet's last name.
I see.
My parents.
Her
my
last
father,
name was also Chala. She got married since.
Okay. Maybe she's related to this poet, so my parents liked the name and gave it to me as a first
Really?
name.
I mean, her name is Niloufar Chala. She was my friend from Wellesley.
Okay, awesome. Maybe she was related to him.
So where did you study in Turkey? Are you a Roberts product?
Yeah.
You all are. I mean, it's amazing. I know the whole Jing Bang lot of you, at least in my time.
It changed a bit. Now it's much more.
What is it? It's more Turkish.
Oh no! In the sense, people from other schools come to the U.S. as well. But
Oh, I
upon-
see. I see. A lot of, I mean, in my time, all Roberts.
Yeah. My cohort of around 140 people. So your generation probably they split Bosphorus University from the high school. So I
That's right.
graduated from the high school,
I see.
and then the university became Bosphorus. So my graduating class of 140, almost 40 of us got PhDs in the U.S.
It's Arjun.
And most
Arjun,
stayed
sorry.
here
Where is your name from?
Mumbai, India.
because of the way.
But you're saying it's losing its.
No, I mean, still
The
people
others
are
have come
coming,
and
but there are many other schools, and also the income level of the country has gone up. So a lot of people can afford to send their kids. Yeah.
But Turkey itself is in an interesting situation.
Yes, that's to say the least.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. We'll be getting started soon. So if you could please take your seats. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the EPIIC Symposium for our second panel of the day. My name is Arjun Padalkar, and I'm an International Relations and Quantitative Economics major at Tufts University, and I'm in this year's EPIIC class. Thank you all for coming to our second panel of the day, where we'll be discussing how South-to-South migration is shaping our world. Popular discourse on migration has historically and today almost primarily focused on migration from poor developing countries to richer countries. Even when we think about the context of migration for host countries, we think about migrants that are coming from these developing countries, and the narrative remains of how these migrants are trying to take our jobs. Even when we consider Europe, the dominant narrative remains and is popularized as migrants and refugees coming from the Middle East. However, this discourse is far from complete. In 2005, 2 out of every 5 migrants were supposedly from developing countries and had settled in developing countries. Just yesterday, Minister Lajcak had said that 34.8% of the migrants are moving from developing countries to other developing countries. Even in absolute numbers, this quantity of migrants moving from south to south regions is rising. In Africa, African countries hosted 24.7 million migrants in 2017, which is a 28% increase since 1990. Migration from south to south regions has also spurred urbanization and development. And the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development states that there's going to be a massive spike in urbanization in 2050. Therefore, we have convened here today to discuss how south to south migration and what are its historical causes, what are the drivers of south to south migration, such as wage disparities, income inequalities, conflicts, contiguous borders, and any other causes that has driven people from developing countries and made them move to other developing countries. Before I introduce our panel, I would like to explain the structure of this conference. Each panelist can speak for 10 minutes by providing essentially an oral op-ed. After that, I would recommend that the panelists ask each other questions to engage in more discourse. If there are no questions, I would be opening the floor to questions from the audience. Without further ado, let's get this panel started. To my right is Professor Aisha Jalal, the Mary Richardson Professor of History at Tufts University. Professor Jalal has been the Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, Leverhulme Fellow at the Center of South Asian Studies, Fellow of the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in DC, and a MacArthur Fellow from 1998 to 2003. Please put your hands together for Professor Jalal.
Oh, I thought you'll be introducing everybody.
Oh, please begin.
Well, I'm delighted to be here at the EPIIC, this year's EPIIC Symposium. I've been attending EPIIC Symposiums for years, for decades, if that's believable, and it's so wonderful to see such a fantastic turnout, and I love the poster, as I was telling Heather, but I have been associated with the EPIIC program for years, and it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. Migration is as old as human history. Indeed, without migration, there would be no human history. Yet from our presentist perspectives, migration has not only, as Arjun was pointing out, become the single biggest challenge, according to some people, presented by globalization, but associated with securitization narratives, has come to be seen as a menace whose eradication requires building walls along state borders. It's amazing how many walls are going up, but I'm more concerned about the mental walls that we have that are going up even faster. How did we get here? Migration has been part and parcel, as I've said, of human history, which is of initiative, ingenuity, and also great cruelty and inhumanity. The United States is often described and is described as a land of migrants, but so too is the South Asian subcontinent. I wonder what part of the world isn't somehow a land of migrants. The great poet Rabindranath Tagore had written that the Shakas, the Hans, the Pathans, and the Mughals had mingled to create India. If South Asian society has been crafted by waves of in-migration, the subcontinent has also been the source of out-migration for millennia. When I visited Cambodia, for instance, a few years ago, I was struck by the temples of Siam Reap that was seeping with Indian influence, and these temples were built 2,000 years ago. South Asian merchants and traders, preachers and pilgrims have been traversing the Indian Ocean interregional arena ever since the code of the monsoons was broken 7 centuries before Christ. More relevant to our present concerns are the great migrations during the modern era of global history. The Atlantic slave trade was undoubtedly the most brutal example of forced migration in the early modern period. After the formal abolition of slavery and the slave trade in the early 19th century, large movements of indentured labor from South Asia replaced slave labor in the plantation complex worldwide. This was South-South migration as workers from the subcontinent joined coolie labor from China to work on sugar, rubber, and other plantations in Mauritius, Natal, Malaya, the Caribbean islands, and Fiji. In addition to these laborers, Indian intermediary capitalists from Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, and elsewhere played a key role in building the architecture of global capitalism. Worldwide economic crises of capitalism, such as the Great Depression of 1929 and the early 30s, disrupted and to some extent reversed these migratory flows. No South Asian perspective on migration can ignore the massive social disruptions and ensuing flows of refugees during the partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947. Some 17 million people were shunted across newly demarcated frontiers of a subcontinent ostensibly divided along lines of religion for the first time in its history. It's probably the largest single forced migration in recent memory. Since 1947, India and Pakistan, as all of you would know, have been to war over the North Indian princely state of Kashmir on 2 separate occasions, while a third war in 71 that was preceded by flows of millions of refugees into India and resulted in the breakaway of Bangladesh. If this kind of induced instability in the South resulting from the politics of decolonization are not enough, in fact they are a trigger to further migrations. Wars have produced refugee populations in their millions. Iran and Pakistan continue to bear the burden of the ongoing Afghan war, with millions of refugees and also others who have somehow managed to settle permanently in these countries. The unending war in Afghanistan has cost Pakistan dearly. It has wreaked havoc with Pakistan's social fabric and altered the country. If the past is another country, Pakistan is that country after the Afghan war. Operations against militants holed in the northwestern tribal areas bordering Afghanistan has resulted in millions of refugees, IDPs. Many of them remain displaced to this day, creating severe urban tensions stretching cities like Karachi to the limit and creating tensions of their own kind. Today, IDPs constitute 2/3 of forcibly displaced people in the world. If there's a need to revise the UNHCR's 1951 Refugee Convention to take better account of crises like Syria, Iraq, not to mention several others in the world, there's an even greater need, I think, to expand the UNHCR's scope to include more systematically and effectively the growing problem of IDPs. Finally, coming to the United States of America, I think the US has to reflect more on its own history in relation to immigration from South Asia and beyond. It would be a mistake to regard the current anti-immigration prejudice as a mere Trumpian aberration. More than 100 years ago, Tagore had criticized the anti-Asiatic agitations in America for depriving the aliens of their right to earn their honest living on these shores. Either you shut your doors against the aliens or reduce them into slavery. Tagore said in his stinging rebuke to American immigration policies of that time. America has to decide whether it wants to embrace the poisoned legacy of its Orientals' exclusion laws of the early 20th century or inject a measure of empathy into its approach in negotiating the waves of migration unleashed by war and poverty in distant parts of the globe. There is an urgent need to challenge the rhetoric against so-called illegal migrants. I can understand that people have entered countries illegally, but you can't call migrants illegal. I mean, in the sense of it's saying that if a human being is illegal, they may be irregular, they may be informal, but to say that somebody is illegal casts an entire aspersion on these people and the circumstances that have gone into their condition. I mean, the simple label of refugees does not really account for the variety of factors that have led to displacement, and I think we need to be a little bit more attentive rather than labeling people illegal. The president of the ruling party in India has publicly declared these so-called illegal migrants as termites. If such inflammatory sentiments are not questioned and critiqued vigorously by scholars, activists, and citizens, our basic humanity, I believe, will be corroded beyond repair. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Jalal. I hope the words of Tagore ring true at our elections coming up this year. Next, we have Dr. Jackler Austin. Dr. Austin is a professional migrant who is the lead economist for the Development Research Group at the World Bank. His research explores the nexus of globalization of product and labor markets, government policies, and economic development. Please put your hands together for Dr. Austin.
Well, it's working, right? It's a pleasure to be here. I timed Dr. Jalal. She took 7 minutes, so I'm going to grab her 3 minutes here.
I'm just giving you more time.
Great, thank you. I come from a very imperialistic subfield of social sciences, so we grab whatever we get. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank for the invitation, and it's great to be with the students, especially Dr. Williams, I guess, is not here. I wanted to especially thank him. Now, I'm going to, here's the clicker. I'm going to talk. So a lot of the things I'm going to mention are from this recent book we published. I have a copy here. And I also have, I travel light, so I didn't bring extra copies, but the book is online. So it's for free if you're interested. And I have 4 copies of the overview. So the first 4 people who are to email me can grab it. And that's a signal of your, here's my email address. Oh, no. My email address is very easy. It's cosden@worldbank.org. And after you email, please put your phones away. Because I'm going to say this, I have 3 teenagers at home. And part of my work, I'm in the research department. I do, instead of teaching, my obligation is I work with government officials, especially politicians all around the world. What I noticed, teenagers and politicians all suffer from this attention deficit disorder. You cannot grab their attention unless you're really entertaining for more than a couple minutes. And it's partly thanks to those darn phones. Everybody's on their phones constantly. And I have a junior who's now visiting schools, and I realize I'm going to be paying quite a bit of money starting next year. Now, your parents are paying $1 a minute for you being sitting here instead of listening to us, looking at your phones. So put your phones away, please. It's really, when I see my daughter. Anyway, so why South-South migration? Let's jump at it. It's going to be all pictures. Pictures speak louder than words. Because it is big. You heard the numbers. It's 34.5%. Around 10% of my time at the World Bank, I am in charge of all these migration databases because we actually don't have data on it. And even constructing these databases going back in time, bilateral, it's a mess. But you see it, and I'm one of the people, I think, who's guilty and responsible for making a big fuss about South-South migration. But the more you study something, the more you realize why you're wrong, and that's why this talk is going to be about. Now, this is, for those of you who know a little bit of economics, we have these cumulative distribution functions, which basically says you add up, right? Think of the distance people travel, right? Pairwise countries. And then you see then you add up. So this is basically saying, if you look at the green line at 0, neighboring countries, around 75% of the refugees go to a neighboring country, right? That's what it's basically saying. Where it crosses the 80% line, that's around 2,000 kilometers. So around 80% of the refugees travel less than 2,000 kilometers, so on and so forth. If you look at unskilled, low-skilled migrants, it's the majority, slightly above 50% go to a neighboring country, right? So this tells you something about the pattern of global migration. The high-skilled migrants, basically people with tertiary education, travel quite a bit more, but it's the same. So it gives you an idea. On average, if you look at the 50% cutoff, high-skilled migrants travel only around 5,000 kilometers, right? So migration is extremely regional. That's what this graph was telling us. For example, if you look at, let's look at South Asia. In 1970, almost 95% of all South Asian immigration was in the region, right? It declined now. That was partially because of the partition of India, right? The refugee inflows, those people were still alive in the 70s, and as they pass away, their share declines significantly, and instead South Asian migration is replaced with migration to the Persian Gulf and the high-skill migration, as in the case of Dr. Jalal, to the West, right? So that's what the idea is. But now, there's a huge problem with this picture. And I'm going to tell you what these two problems are and what the mistake we're doing as both academics and policymakers. First is we don't know what South is, right? It is human cognitive bias, I believe. We like to categorize things, right? It makes us easy because you're a man, you're white, you are this, you're young, you are educated. It makes us easy to process information. And that's why it's easy to say South. Now, this is the South. When I was digging through for the presentation, this is the Brandt line from 1980. This is how he drew the South, right? And you know, you can agree, disagree, whatever it is. The most southern country in the world, well, two of the most southern, New Zealand and Australia, are in the north, right? But nevertheless, let's leave that aside. He put the Soviet Union. This was before the break of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, in the north, but that was it. This is the IMF definition of North-South. GDP per capita, $10,700. I have no idea where that number comes from. Probably it comes so that they can include certain countries in the north. They looked at the data and they picked it, right? This is the IMF. This is the World Bank definition. We are across the street, right? The IMF is here, the World Bank is here. We don't really talk to each other. We actually don't like each other. There is a huge, I can give a whole lecture on why, but this is the World Bank definition. Here, Russia is split because of actually declining metrics on many measures, what's happening in Russia. But that's how the World Bank puts, right? And there's a difference between the IMF measure and the World Bank measure. But, more or less, okay, we agree, we disagree. Here, for example, the Brazil is a high income and Turkey is a high income. Oh, sorry. But in the World Bank definition, it is not. Okay. Now, this is based on Human Development Index, right? This is much more stratified, so you have more categories. And, overall pattern is the same, but there are differences. And this is according to Wikipedia. All right? Okay. So I showed you 5 maps. We all, I think, would agree Finland, Sweden, and the US and Canada are in the north, and we would all agree Rwanda and Paraguay and, I don't know, Bangladesh are in the south, but there are a whole bunch of countries in the middle, right? Because there are many candidates for the criteria. There's not one criteria for being the south. One is GDP per capita. That's what economists like me like to argue. But there's geography. So is Moldova south or north? I don't know. Has anybody been to Moldova? Right? What do you think? You'd say it's north?
Geography.
Yeah, it's geography, right? Because it's also insulting to the Moldovans to say you're the south when you're in the middle of Europe. Or Albania. Is it north or south? I don't know. Then there's the human development metrics. That gets even more complicated because you have countries like Costa Rica, or you have regions of India like Kerala, which have the Western standards, but on the other hand, they are in the south, right? Because of wrong geography. And then there's the whole democracy, human rights angle. Then that puts us against the Saudis. Are they the north or the south? And then, of course, the political alliances. Okay? So there are some countries which satisfy all this criteria, like, as I said, US, Canada, Finland, Sweden. All right? And there are certain countries which don't satisfy, okay, but then there are a whole bunch in the middle. And these are the problem countries for this classification. Okay? So you have the Persian Gulf. Right? They're high income, but they are not really doing so well on the political alliance or the human rights angle. You have Singapore, Taiwan, Malaysia. And also countries change, right? These are the rapidly developing countries. Then you have Russia, Kazakhstan, Moldova, Ukraine, Azerbaijan. I don't know. Right? And then Turkey, of course, I'm Turkish. And Turks have a huge chip on their shoulders because they want to be Western when it suits them, or they want to be Eastern or Southern, whatever suits them. Right? Then South Africa, and of course, Costa Rica, Chile, and Argentina. But the problem especially is severe for migration. Why is that? Now, there are 2 single most important determinants of migration patterns. When you run these gravity models, like you do in trade, bilateral migration flows, the single most important determinant is the income gap, right, between a pair of countries. And the second one is distance. So if you're Costa Rica, or if you're Singapore, or if you are Saudi Arabia, or if you're Turkey, in a poor region but relatively higher income, then you're going to attract a lot of people, right? So these problem countries are not only problem because of classification, but they're also the high-income destination countries. Okay? So when we talk about South-South migration, we're basically talking about migration from their neighbors to these guys, right? But we put it under South-South. Now, okay, they said it, then they're also immigration countries, right? I said all of this. So this tells you, look at your Saudi Arabia, how dark it is. Or look at, well, Malaysia kind of comes out. Singapore is too small, but it is dark, trust me. All right? And then in relative terms, Costa Rica is dark, and South Africa is dark, right? So you see all of this pattern, how it comes out. But, we say, South-South migration, but this is what we're talking about. And it is, the nature of migration doesn't necessarily change. It's just these guys have done well in a relatively bad neighborhood, and they're attracting migrants for the exact same reason. So is it any different if somebody, a Filipino worker, goes to Singapore, goes to Saudi Arabia, or comes to the West? From an economic point of view, it is not, right? But the now, other problem is the following. Well, not a problem, but one thing you need to be aware of, what distinguishes migration flows. So as I said, part of my task, we construct these migration databases, there is as much art, quote unquote, involved in that science. So think of there are around 200 countries in the world. So that gives you a 40,000 cell matrix, 200 by 200, right? Out of that 40,000 cells, 300 of them account for, especially in 1970, 85% accounted for 300 corridors. Out of that 40,000 accounted for 85% of the world migration, right? World migration is extremely concentrated. It is not like trade, it is concentrated. It is the Mexican migration to the US. It is the Turkish migration to Germany. It is the Zimbabweans in South Africa, or it's the Indonesians in Malaysia, so on and so forth, right? And it is regional, and it's this concentration that is critical. And today, it went down a little bit. In 2010, it is at 73%. By the way, everybody uses the UN population division's migration numbers. They look at, there's a number there for 2017 matrix. Don't believe it. Because migration data come from annual censuses, and that they happen every 10 years. What the UN population does is they guess. They don't even guess. They just draw a linear line and come up with the 2017 number. So those are not actual data if you're going to be using for your papers and stuff. But going back, picking a bone with our nemesis. So this is what it is, and this is reflected in the South-South migration as well, right? So now, let's look at some of the main corridors that make up into this top 300. All right, they're the South-South ones. So one is, I can say, is from India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Philippines, Egypt to the Persian Gulf, right? Within Ukraine, Russia, back and forth, all right? Then there's Zimbabwe to South Africa, or Philippines, Indonesia to Singapore and Malaysia. Malaysia to Singapore, then between Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. So this is what comes out when you look at the data, and or from Syria to Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. Now, the second problem is that these migration corridors are very diverse. The sources of migration, the reasons of migration are very different. If you look at the first one, right, it's unskilled, mostly unskilled, and economic. There are skilled people, but it's mostly unskilled migration to the Persian Gulf. Ukraine, Russia, Ukraine, and this you can include Kazakhstan there, you can include Belarus, Moldova, you name it. A lot of this migration was pre-collapse of the Soviet Union. When people moved, it was a single country, right? Suddenly we drew borders, and suddenly people became migrants when it wasn't in their intention. So that artificially inflates the numbers, right? You look at Zimbabwe to South Africa. You can say it's political reasons. You can say it's economic reasons, right? Philippines, Indonesia to Singapore and Malaysia, it's very much like from South Asia to the Gulf. But from Malaysia to Singapore, it is high skilled, right? And there's an ethnic dimension. It's the ethnic Chinese who feel opportunities are limited in Malaysia are going to Singapore, and Singaporeans are very smart in attracting them. Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, right? Again, it's the partition of India. It was partly refugee flows, partly even prior, but most of those people have passed away, so they don't show up in the data anymore. But it was a refugee flow. From Syria to Turkey to Jordan, Lebanon, it's refugees, right? I can go on and on and on, right? The nature of South-South, what we label as South-South, is very different than actually South to North. We obsess about the migration to the North and it's the refugees, but actually the biggest chunk of migration to the North is economic migration, right? South-South is much diverse, and it is the reason I'm saying all of this, it is dangerous to label and put all of them under the South-South pot. All right. Now, here's the issue of the complexity. This is one of the figures we did for this book. It's the paths of Syrian refugees. Right? When you're a Syrian refugee and you're deciding whether if I'm going to go from Aleppo, should I go somewhere else in Syria, or do I go to Lebanon, or do I go to Turkey? If I go to Turkey, where am I going to stay in Turkey, or am I going to try Europe? It is extremely complicated, but you put it under South-South, and you assume it's the same experience as a Filipino maid working in Saudi Arabia. You're actually not finding a solution. You're making it much more complicated. All right. Now, but what does South-South migration imply? So let me put a couple pictures, and then I'm going to finish there. It changed the South, especially if you look at so that was the first graph was the refugees, right? And this is economic migration. This is Sheikh Zayed Road from Dubai. Is there anybody from Dubai? All right. This is 1980, before most of you guys were born, but I was in middle school at that time, right? This is literally what it looked like. This is what it looks like today, right? I don't know any other part of the world that experienced such rapid transformation unless you found gold or something like this, right? This is literally, and let me ask you this, what percentage of do you think people who are involved in construction in Dubai are immigrants?
90%.
It's 99%.
90%.
And that what 1%, by the way, are we recording this? Can I say politically incorrect things? And this is all my personal opinion. It's not binding the World Bank. But so that 1% is mostly ceremonial, right? Because you have to put somebody, a native, in charge. I don't know how much work they actually do. If you ask it's the engineers, the managers, the guy who carries the cement, everything. It's all immigrants. Now, if you look at the data, there was a presentation yesterday showing how the number of migrants increased in Europe from 3% to 10% and how dangerous it is. Well, ask the people of Dubai, the natives of Dubai. Would they have preferred to live in this Dubai or this Dubai, right? Where they are now a significant minority of the population. All right? I think the number is around 9-1, 9 being the immigrants. Okay? So this is how immigrants, and there were no immigrants pretty much in 1960, probably even including in 1980 in Dubai. Right. All right. So there is another dimension of South-South migration. One is what does to the north, in this case, the north, right, the destination country. And this is my final example. Anybody from the Philippines? No? Anybody from Singapore? All right. So I've been to Singapore only once, right? So on a Sunday, all these parks, you go and you see the Filipino maids getting together and socializing, right? And there's a significant number of them. And this, oops, sorry, wrong button. And this is apparently a big deal in Singapore. This is the Women Icons Award ceremony. These are professional women who achieved a certain level of success, and they acknowledge them. The single reason those women are up on that podium is because the other women are in the picture. All right? Compared to Korea and Japan, which don't accept Filipino maids, and as a result, fertility rates have declined, and they have significant aging problems, Singapore government was smart enough to allow maids to come in. So as a result, highly educated Singaporean women can enter the labor force, at the same time have children, and at the same time take care of their parents. But the story doesn't end there. There is this mutual beneficiary relationship, doesn't end there. And these are the Filipino students in Manila. These are the daughters or the sisters of the maids in Singapore. Okay? This South-South migration, I'm sure I'm insulting the Singaporeans by calling it South, but that's how the Wikipedia does. All right? So this is what the South-South migration does. Okay? Now, if I were to take away the Filipino maids, the labor force participation of college-educated women in Singapore would decline by 30%, and so would the school attendance of girls in the Philippines. All right, since we are talking about this is the week of the Women's Day and the Women's Week, you have to notice that the most important dimension of South-South migration is actually gender. All right, finally, I'm wrapping up. This is one of my favorite figures. When people are asked what is the most important issue facing your country, migration comes first. Ironically, it is also first in Poland and Lithuania, which don't have any immigrants. Right? So what does this tell you? All right? There are a lot of social scientists here, anthropologists, sociologists, they can say xenophobia, this and that. I don't know. I don't have expertise in these areas, but I'll leave it there. Ironically, if you ask what do you think about the economy or unemployment, this is how they are ranked in those countries. Okay? Now, the debate we're having, I make a living out of migration, right? My kids are hopefully going to go to college and I'm going to pay for their tuition thanks to migration. There is demand for my services because it's such a big issue, right? I'm extremely appreciative of that. But at the end of the day, the issue is not about migration. Okay? The world is going through rapid transformation of globalization. Now look at the people sitting around you. You have come, or your parents have come from very different parts of the world. But you will realize by the time you leave Tufts, you have much more in common with each other than a lot of the people you share citizenship with. All right? That's the nature of the thing. Especially the global educated elite have much more common with each other than their own people. That's what it is. It's not a value judgment, but that's what's happening. This globalization is the result of both technological and communication revolution, but also the nature of the production, which is these economies of scale. Right? The world has gone through the same process at the end of the 19th century, thanks to the railroads and telegraph, and different production technologies where we could have big factories. Right? And it created huge dislocations. It is no different than what is happening today. It is identical. It is happening in the north very severely, whether it's offshoring or losing jobs. But there are the beneficiaries, the highly educated benefit from this. It is the people who are in the middle who are losing. The world dealt with this through creation of the welfare state, because we were going to go civil wars. There was all these, historians know it much better than I do. There was fear that the communism was going to come to Europe. Actually, Germany was likely to be the first communist state, right? But it was averted. It still didn't work. We had 2 world wars as a result of this globalization rate. I'm not saying we're going to have a world war. The wars have different shapes and things. But migration has become the face or the channel through which we talk about this globalization. It's not about migration. Migrants are not causing this. It's technological innovation and the global integration that's causing this. And I'm sure we will figure out a way, because I'm also positive opponents of globalization are both economically, but more importantly, morally, are on the wrong side of history, because that's what history has shown us. All right? So I am not a big fan of talking about South-South migration, because I think it leads to huge aggregation and making a lot of mistakes. And we need to look at the underlying sources, what the corridors are. I'm okay looking at the issues of the corridors, because corridors are what the most important metric here. But at the same time, we need to look at the bigger issue, especially of the South, because where South is, especially South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and sub-Saharan Africa is going to be where the action is going to be for the next 100 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Austin, for your illuminating speech. I hope moderating this panel allows me to get first preference for your book.
All right.
Next, I'd like to welcome Mr. Nizar El-Faqih, who is a Venezuelan lawyer at the Harvard Kennedy School and the founder of Pro Juris, a civil society organization founded on the study and defense of the rule of law. He has also been a consultant for Human Rights Watch and the Venezuelan National Congress. Please put your hands together for Mr. El-Faqih.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And thank God that we have such a nice panel today with a very important background on migration from a technical perspective. I'm, in essence, an activist, a human rights activist, a Venezuelan human rights activist. So I apologize if I show you a lot of passion in my words when I speak about my country and the situation of my country. So I'm going to present today a presentation that basically relies in three conclusions, or three main arguments. The first argument is that the main reason of the crisis in Venezuela started more or less 10 decades ago. It's not a recent crisis. And we are now facing the consequences of a crisis that started a long time ago. The second argument I will develop today is that this is an structural crisis which has a political component, an economic component, and a social component. And of course, the immigration crisis is only one of its exteriorization, right? And my third argument is that this crisis will keep growing the next months and the next years if the main cause doesn't change, which is the regime in power and the democracy situation in my country, right? So in order to explain these three arguments, I'm going to provide some context. I'm going to talk about some political issues that may be sensitive for some of you, but of course you will have the chance to ask me questions or formulate your arguments when we have the chance to do that. So inflation, and this is of course one of the causes of the economic crisis that we are facing today and that are motivating the huge migration crisis that we are facing in Venezuela. Inflation in the country is in 2018 estimated in 1,300,000%, right? 1,300,000% is the highest inflation in the world, according to many international organizations. You can see very, very easy in the internet many sources talking about not this number, but a higher one. I'm trying to be conservative with the data. It means that per hour in Venezuela during 2018, we have 143% of inflation, all right? So if you have $1 to buy a chocolate, I give you $1, you go to the market. The time that you invest going to the market makes that same chocolate cost $3. So you don't have opportunity to buy that chocolate anymore. So imagine that situation, that simple example, in the many things that a common family, an average family in Venezuela needs, such as milk, toilet paper, coffee, meat, chicken. The same is happening. The inflation, when we see and we disaggregate the data of inflation, we see that those things that are basic for the Venezuelan people are the things that are more impacted by the inflation in the country. When we see that the index of economic freedom, which is an index that has been developed by many institutions, such as the one that provides this chart here, we see that in Venezuela in 1998, where in the same line, in the average line in the index of economic freedom, that basically reflects how is the country doing in property rights, judicial effectiveness, freedom of employment, and monetary trade and investment freedom. And now in 2017, you can see the line, how it declined progressively, and now we are doing really bad in that sense. And it has to do with basically policies that were taken in Venezuela since the government of President Hugo Chavez. And massive expropriation of 5 million hectares took place in Venezuela during the last 10 years. Expropriations of productive lands, expropriation of more than 1,000 transnational corporations that used to produce food and medicines, and expropriations that today reflects that those same lands that were productive 10 years ago are not producing anymore. Same is happening with the companies, right? So it's not a crisis that started today. We're facing the consequences of bad decisions in the economic field. At the time, of course, we had in the same moment in which this massive expropriation, unprecedented expropriation in Venezuela was taking place, we were having the highest price in the oil sector. So being Venezuela one of the most important exporter at the time, of course, having an oil price on $130 per barrel, you know, it makes a huge impression that the country was doing well and we had the money to import those things that we used to produce. So we didn't feel the consequences of the crisis because we have a lot of money from the oil sector to cover by importing food and medicines, substituting the national productive system that we used to do. So what the people of Venezuela is doing to survive, we will see here, of course, there are many things that Venezuelan people are doing to survive, but I basically point out 3 major things. The first one is protest. People have been protesting in Venezuela for a long time. If we see the data of protests in Venezuela during the last 6 years, you know, to demystify the conclusion or the perception that protests are taking place now because of the political crisis that the country is facing, when you see the data, this data is from the Observatorio Venezolano de Conflictos, which is an NGO that has been collecting this data for a long time in the country. We see how protests in Venezuela has been really high, comparatively speaking, with the historical data that we have during the last years. 27 protests per day, which is a very high number, and is distributed among the 23 federal states of the country. And the answer, I mean, people protest, and when we see the drivers of the protest, of course, the main driver has been the economic situation, and the answer of the government has been repression. Repression that has led to an unprecedented number of detentions in the context of protests. Never in our history we have faced a situation in which more than 3,000 people in 1 year are detained because of protesting, such as it happened in 2014, or a situation in which more than 5,000 people were detained in the context of protest in 1 single year, such as it happened in 2017. So that's the answer of a regime that doesn't want to listen what the people is claiming, that really want to only keep in power and don't recognize what's the main causes of the protest that the people, that the people really have, are facing many problems. Moreover, especially the poor people, which is in Venezuela is the majority of the population. So in order to face this crisis, when we see the data, I don't have the time to develop all the data, but when we see the data of the lack of food and medicines, the shortages that have been taking place in the country because of the destruction of the productive system, we see, well, that of course the government have been trying to take some measures in order to provide food to the people, right, to face this huge crisis. So one of the most important method that the government is using is the club boxes, which is a box that has some food inside and is distributed in many places in the country. It's estimated that now it's covering like 5 to 7 million people monthly in Venezuela. So, but in order to have access to this club box, which of course have the face of President Chavez and President Maduro, you have to have this Homeland ID, right? This Homeland ID is an ID provided by the Venezuelan political party, the Socialist political party, that has a QR code in its back, and is the method that they use. Basically, you have to be registered in the Socialist political party in order to have this ID, and you need that ID to have access to that club box, which in fact is the only the only way in which many Venezuelans can have access to food in this moment because of the crisis. So of course, when we see the data, people in Venezuela are not living because of their work. They are with an inflation of more than 1 million % is impossible. With the crisis that we have nowadays, it's impossible. So basically, what the data shows is that approximately 30% of Venezuelans now live on remittances, and between 50 to 60% depend on subsidies and the club boxes that I mentioned before. So basically, 80 to 90% of the Venezuelan people that live in Venezuela now are capable of surviving in the country because because they receive money from their family abroad, those who are migrating, or because the government is giving them the club boxes or some direct subsidies in order to make them able to eat and have access to some medicines. So it's a humanitarian crisis. The UN Refugee Agency says that the ongoing political and socioeconomic developments in Venezuela, and you know, this is very important. This is very important because the United Nations is recognizing the main cause of the crisis. The ongoing political and socioeconomic development in Venezuela is not something that is being said by the opposition political parties or by the media. It's something that is being said by United Nations, by independent agents that have a lot of legitimacy to say that have a lot of data, and that conclusions came, of course, after all the researchers that they have been doing for a long time. And basically, the United Nations said that these have led to the outflow of an estimated 3 million Venezuelans into neighboring country and beyond since 2015. And it's estimated that 1.5 million people fled the country during the last year, since, according to the last report of the United Nations Refugee Agency. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, in the same line, says that this is an unprecedented, there is an unprecedented general shortages of medical supplies and medicines in Venezuela, and this is one of the main causes of the immigration crisis. Then the same report made by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, again an independent organism, says that the exodus in Venezuela is driven by violence, hyperinflation, and shortages of food and medicines. We don't have time to this, but well, we have a little bit of the context. I don't think that we have time to do that.
You could provide the concluding statements as well.
Sorry?
You could provide the concluding statements as well.
All right. So basically, what the Venezuelan people, including the NGOs and the human rights movement, are claiming for in Venezuela in order to try to start to solve this situation, this humanitarian crisis that is taking place in the country, is to allow the country to recover its democratic system. And in order to do that, we are claiming for a free and democratic elections, which is the same that many countries in the world, as you have seen, has been claiming for the last month. But basically now there is impossible to hold on a free and democratic elections, basically because all the political parties that belong to the opposition in the country are illegal. There are no possibility to postulate any candidate if you don't, if you are not member of the socialist political party. So for those of you who think or who have heard that the solution in Venezuela is an election, well, we need first to, to recompose the basic rules of democracy in order to have these elections. We believe that if we open the door again for democracy, we can start solving this humanitarian crisis that is being caused by a regime, that the regime that is in power. As well, we can see all the leaders, basically all the most important leaders of the opposition, those who represent an option to the current regime, are either in jail, like some of them, or are forbidden to participate in election for the next 10, 15, or 20 years. Talking about the humanitarian crisis and the refugee crisis, we can see as well the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees saying that asylum applications lodged in 18 countries had increased by 2,000% since 2014. I mean, Venezuelans are seeking for asylum in 18 countries more than ever before. We have here like an explanation, a graphic explanation of what we call the South-South migration crisis. And well, you see Caracas, Venezuela in red, and then of course Colombia that we have in the north, and Brazil in the south. These are the routes that the Venezuelans use. Basically, most of them, because now the people who are leaving the country are those who are in the worst socioeconomic conditions. So they basically go to these countries walking. They have been called the walkers by Human Rights Watch and some media. And what they do is they go to Cucuta, which is the city that is in the border between Colombia and Venezuela, and from there they go to other cities inside Colombia, and they then go either to Panama at the north, or they go to the south to Peru, and then to Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, Ecuador. So those are, of course, the countries that are receiving most Venezuelan. First Colombia, and then, as the professor explained, Ecuador and Lima, because of the proximity with Venezuela. Well, what is causing this, a problem that is generating the humanitarian crisis is that it's estimated by the same UN agency that more or less 60% of the Venezuelans who had left the country are in an irregular situation. I mean, they have no legal permission to work. They are not legal documents in order to have the rights that any citizen have in any country. And this is, of course, the most important problem that these issues cause in the region. It causes other problems such as exploitation, extortion, violence, including sexual and gender-based violence, human trafficking, forced recruitment into criminal groups, discrimination and xenophobia, as the UN has said. And this is really, really hard. This is happening, especially in Colombia, in the border, because it's the border that the Venezuelans are using the most in order to leave the country. And it's really a problem that is requiring an urgent action from all the region in order to solve, or at least to make this situation better. We are facing, I said that most of the people that are leaving now are people that are the poorest, that are in a very bad socioeconomic condition. So of course they leave the country in a with a very weak position. If you belong to the middle class, as many of you may belong, you have money in your pockets, you can hire a lawyer, you can have access to some education, you can have You can have some access to other tools in order to know what your rights are and in order to get some help wherever you go. But these people, that are mainly poor people, don't have access to those benefits that some of you or some of us take for granted. And of course, these produce many, many problems. But there are as well an unprecedented migration of qualified human capital. This started to happen before the economic situation collapsed the last 3 years. But before that, we had an unprecedented migration of qualified human capital, and it's estimated by the same UN agency that around 50% of medical doctors and 30% of nurses emigrate to other countries of the region. So if we see the problem that Venezuela is having with the health system, this has a lot to do with that issue, right? We don't have medical doctors and nurses because they are leaving the country in a massive way. And when we look at the surveys that measure the willingness to emigrate among young people, you see that 53% of young Venezuelans would like to move abroad permanently in the short term. Okay, so, well, you have here some data. As I said before, Colombia is estimated that have been receiving 1.2 million Venezuelans, Peru 700,000, Chile 265,000, Ecuador 220,000, Argentina 130,000. These are the countries that are most receiving Venezuelan. But then we see the exodus to the Caribbean countries such as Curacao, Aruba, and this is a very huge problem because there are only 26,000 Venezuelans in Curacao, but according to the data that we found out, it represents 15% of the population of Curacao. So it's a lower number, but it produces a higher impact in the country. And in Aruba, there are 16,000 Venezuelans, which corresponds to 10% of the population of Aruba. So again, it's a lower number, but it's causing a huge impact in the Arubian society. Well, to conclude, because we don't have enough time, I would like to share what are the three main solutions that the international community or some international NGOs, some agencies such as the UN, the Inter-American Commission, the OAS, have been pointed out in order to solve the Venezuelan migration crisis. Not to solve the Venezuelan migration crisis, but to face it in a better way. The first one is where to adopt collective protection responses for Venezuelans, mainly in the region. It includes granting a region-wide temporary legal protection regime for all Venezuelans, something that has not happened yet. The implementation of a regional mechanism to distribute both financial costs and the hosting of Venezuela fleeing the country. Today, Colombia, for example, is receiving the most severe impact. More than 1 million Venezuelans are there. So we believe, and the international community that work on this, believe that we need to distribute the financial costs and the housing in order to make more progress. Adopt multilateral strategy to address the root causes that lead Venezuelans to flee the country, and that is a key point because, of course, as long as you will have the same regime denying the situation and behaving in the same way, the situation is going to be the same or even worse. So we have to face the consequences of the crisis, but we also have to work on solving the cause of the crisis. And the other solution that we need is the increase in the contribution that has been given for Venezuelan migrants and refugees. And in that sense, we have the United Nations asking for money in order to do more in the 16 countries in which they are working to help Venezuelans. And we have the same claim from the Organization of American States.
Mr. Al-Faqih, take more questions. Could you please?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much.
So much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Al-Faqih, for your impassioned speech, and we all pray for your country. Up next, we have Ms. Leila Abugheda. Ms. Abugheda is the Regional Director of the West Africa and Middle East Office of FHI 360. a nonprofit human development organization. She has an experience working for the U.S. Agency for International Development and other entities specializing in international development and humanitarian assistance. And also, she was part of the second EPIIC class that was ever formed. Please put your hands together for Ms. Abugeda.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Is this on? You guys can hear me, right? Okay, I have to say, I'm a little intimidated because this is such a very high-level panel with lots of academics. I think that you'll find when you graduate from Tufts, you're going to find you have to make a decision at some point. Am I going to go more the academic route? Is that what I'm passionate about? Or is it more of a hands-on and practical approach? I took the latter one, and so I'm much more of a practical person. I spend my time solving problems on projects that are implemented around the world, and so I kind of struggled with what exactly can I contribute here. So I may not, I'm out of my league on in terms of the rigor of the data and the analysis. However, I'm the only one bringing a prop. Now, you're wondering, why on earth? Has anyone ever seen one of these? You must have. If you've been anywhere in the developing world, you will have. Singapore up there. You've seen these? No? Okay. So this is the quintessential bag that migrants around the world will use. It's large, it's effective, they come in many sizes, they're light and easily transportable. And they're called different things around the world. I won't go into some of the names because some of them are a little offensive. But the one in Ghana, where I'm coming from directly, as in 10 hours ago I got on a plane, this is called a Ghana Must Go, as in Ghana Must Go. And the reason for that, I'm going to tell you the story about it because it has to do with migration. So in the 50s rather, Ghana was actually very highly ranked on the Human Development Index and their indicators, their economic indicators. They were on par with Korea at the time. And that was due to a lot of things. It was an open economy. And then progressively, it started to go a different way as the economy became more closed. And our economists can give more information on that, I am sure. Nonetheless, what happened was Nigeria at the time was not in that situation. So a lot of Nigerians, bordering country, came into Ghana and started to work in various professions. That was all fine and well, and then the situation reversed. Nigeria hit oil in the 70s. And at that point, everyone from Ghana went into Nigeria. Not everyone, but that's an exaggeration, but many, many Ghanaians went into Nigeria. There was no problem initially. These cultures are similar, many of the languages are the same. They're considered, there's no problem specifically. However, that was all fine and well until there was the oil crisis in the 80s. And in 1983, the president of Nigeria, coincidentally with elections coming up, decided that enough was enough. There were too many illegal immigrants in Nigeria. And now let me qualify that, because it is legal, and it was at the time, I believe, for Ghanaians and other West Africans to work in Nigeria and vice versa in the communities. There are certain rules, and of course, eventually you have to get papers. So he's talking about people who don't have the proper documentation working in Nigeria. And the campaign phrase he uses, Ghana must go. So he made an edict saying that any illegal migrants had to leave, and this resulted in 2 million people leaving Nigeria. Even before anything official happened, and the reason for that was he said that once the deadline passes, any Nigerian can denounce someone else to say, this is not a legal person, they need to leave. So people on their own left. And of these 2 million, about 1 million of them were from Ghana. Now, to give some perspective, Ghana currently is about 27 million people. This was years ago, so I'm sure the population was much less. Sorry, I didn't have the time to look at that exactly. Nigeria is 191 million. So this is a drop in the bucket of anything. And nonetheless, the long story short, Ghanaians packed up in these bags, went to the border. The only way into Ghana, the easiest way, is to go through the Benin, the tiny little area that borders with Benin from Nigeria. Then they had to go from Benin to Togo. Those two countries closed their borders. because they were afraid of a not even a refugee, but of returnee flows. Of course, the world condemned this, including the United States at the time, and it was sort of a stalemate for a while. There's some really interesting podcasts, if anyone's interested, about people who lived through this. At first, it was sort of a party because, people are pretty resilient. And on some of these borders, they set up generators, they had great parties and everything, just waiting to go home. Not a lot of trauma at the time, but then as it dragged out and they weren't able to actually get back into Ghana because one border was closed and then the next border was closed, it got pretty ugly. But eventually they came home, and it didn't turn out to be a refugee crisis that lasted for years and years. People came back from Nigeria to Ghana and resettled without a lot of drama, I guess I would say, and were well received. And most of them did not go back to Nigeria. Again, situation reverses. Now Nigeria is doing quite well, but it's a huge country. There are not enough jobs. They're very ambitious. And so now it's starting to be that a lot of Nigerians are going into Ghana where they see a lot of opportunity. And so I did a quick search, and I was talking to people there, which is why I thought of this. There's a lot of talk going on now about there are lots of Nigerians in Ghana. Crime is increasing. Okay, Nigerians are never going to live this down. It's just the attitude. Everyone thinks Nigeria equals crime equals not true, of course, but easy enough to say. And so, as an example, there was a kidnapping in Ghana recently, the first that's happened, and immediately everyone thought Boko Haram is in Ghana. This is starting. It's not boding well. I can't predict what will happen. I can say that everything, you see this around the world, I think that my colleagues will agree, it starts this way, as to, well, they're taking our jobs, the Nigerians can pay more than we can for market stalls, the Nigerians work, what you hear about the Chinese in Indonesia is, well, they work 24 hours a day, we can't compete with this. So these are the types of things that happen, so I will not be surprised at all if in a couple of years we've got Nigeria must go. And I just wanted to highlight that as a very real thing that happens throughout the countries that I work in and you see. I think that the thing I'd like to end on is, think about this. This is how many years ago, 20 years ago, when I went to buy this as my prop in the market before I got on the plane, I just told the driver I need a Ghana must go. And there was not a single hesitation, no surprise that I knew what this meant. And we just went and bought it. So that's my story. I'm probably not going to tell you, I told you I wouldn't be long. I'd really like to hear from everyone else, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Abugeda. I'm sure the EPIIC class and everybody else would have a lot of questions about internships and things.
Yes. Okay.
In the interest of time, I don't think we'll be able to have an interpanel discussion, but I would highly encourage questions from the audience. As usual, we have 2 mics on either side. Please keep your questions to 1 minute or less. Please limit any context to your questions as well, and please ask it to one panelist at a time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this discussion. My name is Maria Teresa Nagel. I am a second-year Fletcher student, and this question is more geared towards Mr. EPIIC, but obviously, everyone, please feel free to chime in. Obviously, one of the big problems facing this quote-unquote South-South migration and any migration is the fact that we're ill-prepared as countries to receive sudden flows that were unexpected. But I venture to say that we turn a blind eye when we're seeing problems arise, and you brought up the fact that this has been going on since 2003, 2006. But the world didn't do anything about it then, and now we have the problem we have. As we see things like the crisis in Nicaragua come about and other crises, what can we do as a society to urge governments to not continue to turn a blind eye, to have contingency plans in place, and to be better suited in the future for the unpredictable, which will always occur? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I think that, I agree with you in everything. And my answer to that question, I have to answer. The first one is that, yeah, the region ignored what was happening in Venezuela and ignored that for many reasons. The first one is that they didn't have this migration crisis affecting them directly, right? They have the richest people of Venezuela coming to Panama, to Colombia, because they were the first ones that left the country when they started to see what was happening. And they were prepared because they had money, and they had a lot of money actually to invest in those countries, or where they were very prepared to be actually to provide some technological skills to the industries, such as happened in Colombia with the oil industry sector. So, it was not something that was really affecting those countries directly. When it started to affect those countries were when the poor people started to leave Venezuela, unfortunately. So these countries now are facing this situation because these poor people are going to those countries to work, of course, but they are in need. They have problems they have severe health problems, they have denutrition in some cases, and they are looking to have some support in the country in which they are arriving. So now it's a problem, unfortunately. It's now that it's a problem. So yeah, I think that we have to make this evident as a Venezuelans. We have to talk about this with data, with facts, avoiding maybe the ideological political issue behind this, and talking about data to show that this situation has been happening for a long time in the country. And we also have to exercise our energy and our power as students, as professionals, to claim for more democracy in our region. It's unacceptable that for whatever reason any government looked to the other way when this terrible situation was happening in the country, and that when many of us, many organizations, many international organizations, claim that this would happen if no measure were taken, and this finally happened, and now the world is facing these terrible consequences. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lauren from Israel, and I study geography and interested in geopolitics. My question is directed to Dr. Austin. That I absolutely agree with you about the wrong geography terms related to north and south directions. And you showed 5 different maps concerning migration that I have two questions about. First, what are the reasons of having too much diversity in data? And second question, how can we recognize a reliable map showing immigration rate in nowadays?
The reasons for diversity, because we have different purposes, right? And we want to show, let's say, take this example, we want to show the South. IMF has one criteria, and, maybe some political organization has another criteria. The World Bank has another criteria, and Willy Brandt, when he came up with this original, has another criteria, because we have different objectives. I think the mistake we are making, and you are implicitly making, is, do we need a map? Do we need a classification of a South? Why do we need that? Why do we have to force ourselves to think that way, right? Because it is, as I said, to a Korean or a Singaporean, it is insulting today to call them the South, because they're way more advanced than most northern countries, quote unquote. And so that's the reason. The reason we have a diversity is because we have different objectives and we're trying to satisfy it, and obviously one size doesn't fit all. And how can we get a reliable map? My answer is, let's not talk about the South. Let's talk about the specific issues. And in a sense, it's cognitively challenging, because then you have to think, when the Filipinos go to Singapore, it's different than the Malaysians going. And similarly, when the Armenians or the Azerbaijanis come to Turkey, it's different than why the Syrians are coming, right? But because the other option is easy. It's that's why we like to say, it's South-South. It's 35%. I take out the partition of India and the collapse of the Soviet Union, it goes down to 25%. If I take out Singapore and some higher income South countries, it goes down, or I think Saudi Arabia, it goes down another 10%. Then suddenly you don't have South-South migration, right? So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And so I agree with you that we don't have to call it a map. So under what can we...
Could you please limit it to just one question? Thank you. After they finish, if there are no more questions, you could ask a follow-up question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So in the interest of time, I'm actually going to retract my question because my question is very similar to hers. But I'd like to amend that to sort of, we understand that there's a need to classify certain countries for data, for policy, for narrative, for whatever purposes. And those categorizations come in different forms, like the developing countries, the global south, low-income countries, and whatnot. And there is a need to move past that. But just from a very personal place, how would you categorize certain countries without going into the specifics, because that may not be possible in certain conversations and narratives and in policy discourses?
Look, I'll give you another example. It's again human nature. When I first joined the bank, so we had an orientation, and this legendary figure from the World Bank came and he said, look, the only way you get Malaysians to implement a policy, you tell them Singaporeans are doing it. Right? You can make all the logical arguments and provide evidence, it won't work. Same thing with Argentina and Chile, or you go to the Greeks, you have to tell them. So this is in our nature to bundle up. This is the essence of the Washington consensus, right? Because it is, we want to say, oh, they are similar, so the medicine, the illnesses are similar, so the medicine should be similar. But again, I don't know how else to put it. That's a dangerous path, going down that path, trying to bundle everything together and assuming the solution is going to be the same. I mean, categorizing everybody the same is the mistake, right? And we make this in other areas, labeling people, you're black and you're white and you're this and you're that, and we call it multiculturalism. I think is also wrong. For me, multiculturalism also means we are multidimensional people, right? And same thing applies to countries. When you band them together, and when it comes to migration, it's even more problematic. So I'm saying, the whole point I'm trying to make here is that that's a dangerous path, and it can create more problems than it can resolve. I understand the desire to simplify our lives when we're making presentations so we can put one number up there, but that simplification leads to policy errors. That's my point.
Thank you.
Can I just add something on this as in a bit of a different twist? So in what I do, a lot of times there's a question for, you're talking about, I hate the term too, South-South cooperation, or we want to send a Southern, I mean, to me that means you're from Mississippi, but a Southern person to go to do, for example, technical work on HIV/AIDS somewhere. And you start to ask yourself some questions, because what does that actually mean? And I would agree, it's an economic qualification and not your ethnicity or your nationality. So what do you do with somebody who is from, like, let's take Ghana. We have one expert who, world class, Ghanaian, our top PEPFAR and HIV/AIDS person. Now, is he South, or is he actually at the expat, quote, level and providing that world-class assistance? And then you get into what's the compensation? Like, do you make more based on where you're from, or do you make more based on what you do? And so I think it is very dangerous to start down this path, and I don't like it either. And if I had my druther, and I cringe whenever it's said.
Hello, my name is Sebastian Loretti from New York, and my question is for Mr. EPIIC. This is obviously in regards to Venezuela, and I just wanted to know, in your opinion, what are policies the United States should take that we aren't taking now, that in order to help Venezuelan migrants and the Venezuelan people the most?
Thank you. I think that the United States and the other countries of the region have to do more. And in that sense, for example, we need to allocate more resources in those places in which the Venezuelans are now basically arriving, in Colombia and Peru mostly, and in Ecuador. There are some, in the borders, there are some places in which the Venezuelans are, and they are in a very, very poor conditions without enough access to food, enough access to medicines. As I said before, they are in need. Most of them are vulnerable people, women, kids, and they need support from the international community. I think that what the United States can do, as well as the international community, mainly in this continent, Canada, United States, and the other countries of Latin America, is trying to coordinate more in order to provide a coordinated answer, in order to allocate more resources, and look for the United Nations High Commissioner and the OAS in order to have those formal channels to coordinate the help. I think that there is a huge opportunity to do more, and I think that United States and the other countries can of course do more in order to make this situation at least better.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
I get this question all the time. And it's generally in a forum where you have these international experts who make a living, right, working in this area. And I think the best thing the US or the Europeans can do is fix their own house, right? I mean, that's what it is. Look, the US has problems, no doubt about it. And it's, again, I will emphasize it's partially due to globalization, especially in Europe, it's maybe partially due to aging, demographic changes, or whatever it is. But because these guys are big, right, when the elephants run, who gets hurt, right? You end up exporting your own problems to the rest of the world. So when the US is now talking about imposing trade barriers on India, right, to help the US, you're not helping India, and you're definitely not helping the US. Just fix your damn own house. That's the only, seriously, that's the first step. We always talk about, oh, let's give money, let's give aid, let's give expertise, let's support democratic things. First, if the US does not impose a burden on the rest of the world, right, actually you will be surprised how much it will help. When the big countries are confident and secure, right, actually a lot of the world's problems get resolved with time. And especially they're good. The world is integrating. The world is integrating via capital, via labor, via product and stuff. But the most important integration of the world is via ideas, right? And because of the phones in your hands, whatever you write today, somebody's sending a tweet, somebody in Caracas is going to be reading it in 3 seconds, right? That's what it is. That is the power. That's the message the US is giving, and how the US is solving its own problems. Because the world, like it or not, looks to the US, looks at the EU, or looks at China. How are they handling their own problems? And that's the biggest help you can give to the rest of the world. Thank you.
So basically setting the example.
Exactly.
And how are we doing?
I wholeheartedly agree. Thank you.
Well, at the end of the day, it's the US is not, there's a, for those of you mathematically inclined, there's a level effect and a slope effect, right? The slope is negative, but the level is still pretty high in the grand scheme of things.
Hi, my name is Mrugang, and I'm a second-year student from India. And a question for Dr. Jalal. So migration has for long been a contentious issue in northeastern India and South Asia in general. And India for long has maintained or held on to the principle that refugees that enter India must go back once the situation has been sorted out wherever they came from. So, but in the last 2-3 months, we've seen the ruling party try to pass the citizenship bill, which would fast-track the path to citizenship for people, for refugees, as long as they belong to certain religions. And like a year ago, so Imran Khan also announced that he would accept a certain few Afghani refugees as citizens of Pakistan. So my question to you is, are we witnessing a genuine paradigm shift in South Asia of the understanding of citizenship and who has a right to it? Or is it merely political furthering a domestic narrative because elections are coming up in India, and Imran Khan's announcement came immediately, very soon after his own election?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I do think that the issue of citizenship is not one that is witnessing a paradigm shift. I mean, there is a political struggle going on. I do think that the proposed citizenship bill
is going to fail the legal challenge. It will be scrapped. It is against fundamental rights. The issue is political. How has the political changed in India, where a settled question on citizenship, because what's salient about the citizenship bill is that it excludes Muslims, but includes everybody else. I mean, Hindus, Sikhs. So my point is that this is a very clear political angle, and it can't be seen as necessarily shifting. I mean, it's something that's going to be fought, not just politically, but also legally. And we'll have to see, once it's defeated legally, what political resonance it has in the future. But it's an ongoing issue. But it is a product of the contemporary scenario. As far as Imran Khan's, I think that's a very small gesture. I think Afghans have been part and parcel of Pakistani society for such a long time that to extend citizenship to a few is really, I think that has been happening all along. And I don't think that that is a very significant move by Pakistan, but the Indian move is significant.
Thank you so much. As there are no other questions, I had a question for the panelists, if they would be willing to engage. Dr. Austin touched upon the impact on urbanization due to migration from developing countries to one another. But want to know what the other panelists thought about how a growing number of migrants moving from developing countries to other developing countries has almost forced, or not even forced, but encouraged cities to have better infrastructure. What would the panelists think about that?
What better infrastructure? I mean, I don't see it. I don't see it where I go. I mean, what I don't understand, Arjun, is whether you're asking whether the pressure of refugees should encourage governments to create more infrastructure. I really find that very difficult, given the constraints under which even basic infrastructure is built in certain parts of the developing world. So I'm not sure that a refugee-specific infrastructure is politically going to go very far, given the current mood. So I do think, to again endorse, I think my point was that ideas are what really matter. And unless we change the way we envisage the problem, no amount of data, all your points taken, is going to help. I do think we are constrained by the way in which we are framing the migration issue. And that's, I think, all we can do for now.
All right. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you so much to all the panelists. Could we have a round of applause for them, please? I would also like to call up Lomax, who's also part of the EPIIC class, to make an announcement.
This is going to be a lot easier to follow up than last night. Hi, everyone. I'm Lomax Turner, and I'm a second-year Tufts student. That was a wonderful panel of thoughtful, meaningful discussion. Learning about migration through experts and professionals in the format of a symposium is a great way to listen and learn. However, it isn't ideal for conversations, discussions, and for getting to know the experts in a more relaxed setting. This is why I invite all of you to come attend our expert-led small group discussion sessions today at 2:30 p.m. They will be held all over campus, all with differing topics and fields regarding migration. We are offering 7 discussion groups, and I'd love to highlight 2 of the discussions that I am most excited about. One breakout session will be looking at migrant labor flow into the Gulf Cooperation Council with a case study into the 2022 Qatar World Cup. Led by research fellow George Naufel, major themes will include the morality of slave labor and what should and can be done about it. Another expert-led discussion will revolve around the challenges both migrants and governments face along the U.S.-Mexican border. The experts leading the discussion will be Carrie Talbot, a legal advocate, and Adam Goodman, a Latin American studies professor. They will be able to answer questions concerning existing and potential migration policy and its ramifications on migrants. Getting to know these panelists personally will only further enhance your understanding of migration in this turbulent world. Check your program for a list of all available discussions and the prospective locations. Take care, and I hope to see you all shortly.